Hello and welcome to Displaced. I'm Sarah Dingle. At the end of last year, the total number of people forced to flee their homes due to genocide, violence, conflict and human rights violations was more than 100 million people. According to the United Nations, the 21st century could be defined by the refugee crisis and the increasingly dire options available to those seeking asylum. Ongoing and newly developed conflicts are driving displacement across the globe. Even before Russia invaded Ukraine, the world was witnessing unprecedented flows of migrants and refugees. Now, 6 months into a war with no end in sight, nearly 7 million Ukrainians haven't returned home. And it's just one conflict among many which have unleashed death and destruction, sending people packing in search of safety and security.
Russia's war in Ukraine has shown the stark choice many refugees around the world are confronted with: stay and risk being killed, or run. Since the start of the war, there have been more than 5.5 million border crossings from Ukraine into Poland. Hungary and Romania have each received more than 1 million. Moldova and Slovakia have had significant refugee flows from Ukraine, while Belarus, an ally of Russia, has seen 16,000 crossings. There have been more than 2 million border crossings from Ukraine into Russia, but it's unclear how many of those people were forcibly relocated. While a number of those who fled have since returned, 6 months on, there are still more than 6.8 million Ukrainian refugees across Europe. And there are concerns that exodus, along with a looming global food crisis, are being used by Moscow to try and politically destabilize the European Union and NATO.
Why is it doing this? So that a new migrant wave hits in particular your countries as well as your neighbours in Europe. How many millions of refugees will there be in Europe if Russian policy causes famine in African and Asian countries?
This war has also led to accusations of racist European double standards in how refugees fleeing conflicts in the Middle East and Africa have been treated compared with those from Ukraine.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles.
But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
But perhaps the most interesting part of this response has been that Europe, a continent in which many leaders, they've told me it's full, we can't take anybody anymore. A boat of 40 poor souls arrives in Sicily, and then they are bickering on the phone on who takes how many, for how long. And now all of a sudden, how is it possible? In 6 weeks or whatever, 6-7 million people come in. They've been taken in generously, they've been taken in effectively.
Leading up to Ukraine's crisis, major conflicts driving migration include Ethiopia's civil war in its northern Tigray region and the overthrow of Afghanistan's democratically elected government by the Taliban. This year, more than 100 million people have now been forced to flee their homes. That's equivalent to 1 in every 78 people on Earth. And there are real fears displacement driven by conflict and climate change will soar even higher.
The Ukrainian refugee crisis is a protection disaster for women and children, as they account for 90% of all those fleeing from Ukraine across the border. Gillian Triggs is the United Nations Refugee Agency's Assistant High Commissioner for Protection. We spoke to her earlier, and I started by asking, how vulnerable is the Ukrainian refugee population?
Yes, it does, because these women and children are fleeing war, they're fleeing conflict, but they then become extremely vulnerable on the routes that they take towards Europe and other parts of the world, they are extremely vulnerable to trafficking, to sexual exploitation. In fact, it really shocked the world that so soon after the conflict, we were seeing people that one might describe really as predators at the main bus stations and train stations where women and children were struggling through to find their way to safety. So it's extremely worrying. Also concerned, of course, about the plight of unaccompanied children, teenagers, who are bewildered and have simply fled, but without support. And so we, along, of course, with the countries concerned, particularly Poland in the first instance, trying to find them guardians and ensuring that they're properly looked after.
Even if they navigate those dangers of trafficking and predators, once settled in some sort of destination country, these families, the vast majority of them will be single mother households trying to work and care for children. Are host nations recognising this added challenge being faced?
They are, and in my own mission to Poland in particular, I was very impressed that the government was very quick to understand the particular needs of women and the need to set up childcare centres, to get the children into school, to get accommodation before the winter comes, and for really quite an important reason, and that is that Poland needs labour and it needs the working capacity of many of these women. They bring a lot of skills. They're educated. They can bring many skills in the care industries, healthcare, education, manufacturing. Women want these jobs. They need them if they're to be self-sufficient. So we actually have a rather unusual situation in which governments receiving women, refugees from Ukraine, know that they need to ensure that there is proper childcare available so that those women can then enter the workforce and become self-sufficient.
There have been some criticisms that Western nations are more likely to accept Ukrainian refugees because those refugees are also Western. Are those criticisms valid?
I think it's fair to say that the criticisms were justified in the early weeks of the war. Of course, we have to understand that it's normal for countries to accept their neighbours when there's conflict, and so we of course we're really very, very pleased to see the European countries reacting so quickly to accept Ukrainian refugees as their neighbours. But we're also aware, and I think the world was aware because the media picked up very quickly on border guards denying access to people from India, from parts of North Africa and Africa. So that was deeply disturbing, and very quickly the UN Refugee Agency sought assurances from those border countries, Poland, Moldova, Slovakia and so on, that their policies were non-discriminatory. That is absolutely fundamental to the work of the United Nations and of course to the Refugee Agency as well. So very quickly that was corrected. And I should also say that the countries, particularly India, evacuated their own citizens very quickly indeed.
Looking beyond displaced people from Ukraine, what the UNHCR warned last year has come to pass, unfortunately sooner than expected. More than 100 million people around the world right now have been forced to flee their homes. That's more displaced people than at any other time in history. How on earth does the UNHCR meet that colossal need? Where do you even start?
Well, it is vast. Perhaps to put it in perspective, when the UN Refugee Convention was agreed 6 years after the Second World War, at that time they were dealing with 2 million displaced people from that war. Now here we are with we fear well over 100 million displaced, as you've said. How do we cope? Well, of course, the critical question is how do these people fleeing cope? And we at the UN Refugee Agency are a facilitator for much of the assistance. The financial support comes from our donors, from countries, but also increasingly from civil society, from the private sector, from the big corporates, for faith-based groups. Finding the funding is critical, and we are seriously underfunded for the scale of the problem.
The vast majority of displaced people come from just a handful of countries. What are the main countries of origin for displaced people in the world at the moment?
Well, of course, we have Syria. That's an 11th year, now entering the 12th year. of warfare, of conflict. Something like the 6 million now being hosted by surrounding countries, particularly, of course, Turkey, Venezuela, political, economic, social problems there. More than 6 million have fled, internally displaced again, very large numbers. We have Myanmar, of course, the Rohingya fleeing the atrocities in that country, 1 million being hosted by Bangladesh. We have others, Afghanistan, of course, well aware of the issues there, and of course South Sudan. So they are the main countries. And perhaps the point to be made here is that overwhelmingly the cause of these flights of people for protection lies in conflict and violence. Of course, other root causes are poverty, inequality, particularly for women, a growing displacement for climate change, and we're seeing now very significant displacement of millions of Pakistan people from floods, severe floods, unprecedented in the recent history of Pakistan. So these are the causes, but overwhelmingly it is conflict and violence, criminal gangs that can, and of course non-armed groups that the governments are not able to control.
Well, in terms of climate refugees, we know those numbers will only increase. Do host nations need to start increasing their humanitarian intake specifically for climate refugees, or marking places specifically for climate refugees, the refugees that we know will come?
Well, that's right. We are seeing it all over the world. But although, of course, there are areas of particular vulnerability, and Bangladesh will be one. Parts of the Pacific we well know, of course, are another. But I've seen mountain slides in Guatemala, in North Central America, houses simply sliding off mountains with unprecedented cyclones and flooding. So the answer to your question is yes, we all have to plan, governments have to plan with civil society for increased numbers of people who will simply be trying to find refuge from the impact of climate change. But I think, again, we have to put things in proportion. At the moment, the critical numbers of people fleeing and seeking protection are, in fact, from violence. It is peace that we need above all else. Then we're better able to cope with the displacement impacts of climate change.
Well, against this colossal rate of displacement that we've been talking about, is there any hope on the horizon?
There is always hope. And I think from the UN Refugee Agency's perspective, we have been, of course, enormously gratified to see the way in which most countries in neighbouring areas of conflict are opening up their borders, bringing people in and treating them with humanity.
Crises in countries like Ukraine, Afghanistan and Myanmar mean 1 in every 78 people on Earth has been forced to flee their home. In 2020, the then Morrison government cut 5,000 places from Australia's refugee and humanitarian program, bringing our intake to just 13,750 places, one of the lowest levels in 45 years. The Albanese government has committed to doubling our intake. Andrew Giles is the new Immigration Minister, and we spoke earlier. I started by asking if we should be doing more.
Well, there's so much to do. As you say, the world right now is experiencing the greatest time of people being dislocated since World War II and possibly in human history. And there's so much a country like Australia, which has been shaped by the arrival of 930,000 refugees since World War II, can do, to be an exemplar to other parts of the world, but also to ensure that we are giving more people a chance to build a new life in safety and contribute to our community.
Your team committed to raising the humanitarian intake to 27,000 places before the election. When is that going to happen? Will that happen from next year?
Well, look, we're working towards that. That's to increase the intake that's government-sponsored to 27,000 places a year, but also to include 5,000 additional community-sponsored places. We're working towards ways to do this in a considered manner, recognising a range of factors, including our responsibility to work with our settlement service providers to ensure that those people who we welcome here as refugees and humanitarian entrants get every support, all the supports they need in order to rebuild their lives and make their contribution here.
There's a lot of people waiting though. There's more than 200,000 Afghan applicants alone since the fall of Kabul. Understandably, people are very keen to know when our humanitarian intake will expand. Will that happen in 2023, do you think?
Well, look, I'm concerned to do all we can to reach that aspiration of 27,000 as quickly as possible, but I can't preempt right now the decisions the government will be making and the consultations that we need to have, including with advocates and refugee communities around the exact timing of this commitment.
Now, advocates have said that Australia's humanitarian intake should be more of a target than a ceiling, which a ceiling obviously is inflexible, but a target means we can increase those as big problems happen, as floods in Pakistan, for instance, as we're seeing now occur, climate refugees and so on. Are you committed to the idea of our intake being a ceiling, or do you think there's some flexibility we can build in?
Well, in the first instance, I'm committed to delivering on the promises we made to the Australian people at the election. And I guess in the present circumstances, I'm particularly focused on some of those commitments we made to Afghanistan, as you mentioned, to ensure that as many people as possible find their ways to safety. In terms of the structure of the program, I guess the other thing that really is important to me and to our government is to have a genuinely non-discriminatory approach so that we are giving help, giving resettlement places to those identified by the UNHCR as most in need of resettlement.
You mentioned the Community Resettlement Program, which is a program that has been trialled with great success in Canada. Do you think Australian communities will go for this? Will there be a lot of Australian communities ready to put their hands up to sponsor refugees in their area?
Well, to quote President Macron, I don't think I know there is enthusiasm, that there is enormous enthusiasm. I was really privileged to be in Gosford on Friday to meet with a group from the Gosford Anglican Church who are engaged in sponsoring a Syrian family, and to speak with them and to see the enthusiasm they had and the preparation they had put into welcoming this family on that family's terms was really inspiring. As I've gone about my work meeting with advocates and organisations, this has been an issue that's raised with me constantly. I know there is such an appetite in the Australian community to recognise that we are living in a world where so many people have been forced to flee their homes and that we can do so much more. I think this is a really exciting opportunity not only to give safe havens to refugees, but also to build a stronger, more cohesive and more caring Australian community, something I'm incredibly excited by.
Some people have said that community resettlement intake should be in addition to our general humanitarian intake. It's currently sort of counted under the same target. Would you be looking at separating those two out?
Definitely, that's the commitment we've made. We want to increase community sponsorship, we want to make it accessible and affordable, but most importantly for it to be additional to the intake that is directly delivered by the government. We want to give the Australian community a chance to demonstrate their compassion, but this should be something that goes on top of what we do as a government.
Now, another hotly debated area of your portfolio, of course, is boat arrivals. Where are we at with boat arrivals on Australian shores currently? What are the numbers like?
Well, you'll appreciate that I can't and I won't talk about Operation Sovereign Borders in any operational sense, but and our policies in respect to the border have not changed. What we believe in a government is that Australians are entitled to expect secure borders, but not, as we saw under the previous government, for this to be at the expense of our humanity and compassion.
Australia is paying for a lot of ad campaigns, particularly in Sri Lanka, warning people about not getting on a boat to Australia and also refuelling the patrol boats of the Sri Lankan Navy. Is that because we are seeing a time of increased arrivals and increased demand?
No, what we are recognising here is that there's obviously a very challenging set of economic circumstances in Sri Lanka. And what we are trying to do more broadly, and what has been the case for some time, is to persuade people not to embark upon dangerous journeys. These are things which have been in place for quite some time and may well need to continue to be in place for some time going forward.
What is the Albanese government doing to target people smugglers in Indonesia, the final staging point for many?
Well, again, I'm not in a position to talk about the operational matters here, but obviously preventing the trade in human beings, in vulnerable human beings, is incredibly important to our government and will continue to be a priority.
The previous government, of course, during the election campaign, we saw a boat arrival being used during the final days of that election campaign and texts being released. Do you have any concerns about the Immigration Department moving forward following that incident? Is there any element of the culture of that department that concerns you?
Well, my concern about the incident you refer to is it was a desperate and cynical exercise on the part of a desperate and cynical government that clearly had lost its moral compass. And it made an absolute mockery of everything that members of that government had said about operational sovereign borders, that they would exploit it or seek to exploit it in such a matter. The review that was conducted shows very, very clearly where blame lay in the government, going to its very top, the former Prime Minister. They shouldn't be hiding behind the public service. There's a job of work to be done to rebuild the immigration function as a core function of national government. I've been going about the offices staffed by the department that I work with, and I've been really struck by how passionate people are about their work. I want to encourage that and build a really strong culture about immigration as a critical nation-building function.
Just finally, we have been told that there is a particular push to increase Australia's humanitarian intake of Rohingya refugees who are currently mostly residing in Bangladesh, having left violence behind in Myanmar. Is there a case for Australia to prioritise Rohingya refugees, given that almost 1 million of them are in limbo in the largest refugee camp in the world in Cox's Bazar, and they have marked 5 years in that place?
Well, what I've been doing in terms of the refugee and humanitarian program is consulting with the community, and that has included representatives of the Rohingya community to hear their concerns and priorities. What I'm determined to do as we put the program together is to take the advice from the group of people best qualified to give advice on who is most in need of resettlement, the UNHCR, and use their advice to guide the decisions that we take in constituting the program for next year.
Andrew Giles, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
Instead of arriving as strangers in a foreign country, a new pilot program encourages regular Aussies to welcome refugees with open arms. The Community Refugee Integration and Settlement Pilot, or CRISP, will aim to resettle 1,500 refugees over the next 3 years, with the hope of following in the footsteps of Canada, which has successfully run a similar model for over 40 years.
Welcome home.
Last week, the first families arrived through the program. They were met by a group of local supporters ready to make them feel at home. One of those supporters was Maggie Patterson, who arrived at Sydney Airport to meet a family of 4 who fled war-torn Syria and take them to their new home in Goulburn.
Our daughter became very ill. She was in ICU for 2 months and passed away. And I always thought, if there's any way that I can pass on the goodness that was shown to me when I was vulnerable and my family were vulnerable, then that's exactly what we'll do.
The Al Daoud family spent 5 long years searching for a country that will take them as refugees. In 2018, father Shadi Al Daoud, mother Ramia Romain and their 2 children fled their home in Damascus, Syria. The family of 4 remained in a refugee camp in Erbil, northern Iraq, until they received the news that they could resettle in Australia as refugees.
We are very happy, very excited for this new life. here is better than the Middle East. More opportunity for the kids, for education, for work. God willing, we are going to have a much better life. We were waiting for 6 years to hear this good news for a new life.
It's hard to leave our country, especially when you're born and raised there and all the people you love and all the family are there. Of course we are going to miss them, but we have to think about our future and the kids' future. The bombs and the killing each other over there is not good for the kids or for our future. It's too much violence for the children. When the fireworks were happening on New Year's Eve, the kids were scared. They thought the war and bombs came back and was happening again. Thank God we come here. It's very safe, especially for the family.
Participants and advocates hope that the pilot program will mark a new chapter in Australia's refugee resettlement story.
We look at the news and we get overwhelmed and we think, what can I do? Well, through CRISP, there is now something that we can all do.
Lisa Button has led the campaign for years for an Australian community sponsorship program, and she joins me now from Melbourne. Lisa, welcome. Australia's had a pretty toxic public debate around refugees and migration for a long time. Do you see this as a reset? Is this the start of a new phase for refugee policy and public sentiment in Australia?
Absolutely, I do. I think it's not only the start of a new program, which for the first time is deliberately bringing together the broader Australian community and refugee newcomers in a way that will change the experience of arriving for so many refugees. But I think it will also change the dynamic in Australia and the conversation around refugees. When people come into contact with each other in the communities as human beings, helping each other, working together at a local level, it really paves the way for a much more informed conversation about refugee challenges and a much more compassionate and empathetic one as well.
So how exactly does it work?
Essentially, it's about a group of 5 or more adults in the Australian community, people who just live in the same general area, putting their hands up and saying, we're willing and able to initiate the migration of a refugee family from overseas into our local community, and we'll meet them at the airport and essentially walk the journey with them for their first 12 months in the country. So some of those are really practical initial things like helping them find housing and register for Medicare and set up bank accounts, enrol in school, those sorts of basic things. But then there's the longer term ambitions of the family in terms of finding work and succeeding in employment and education, or perhaps even setting up a business.
It's a significant commitment. I mean, these are people's lives. Is your group there to make sure that each community supporter group doesn't fall over?
That's right. We've built some fabulous supports for the community supporter groups, and we're also finding ways to get them to support one another by running a national community of practice that gets them talking to each other. And already just in the last week, seeing these first groups get off the ground, we've just been so reassured to see how capable Australians are at doing this work. We put them through some screening, we put them through training, we give them support, but then we step back and say, it's over to you. And when people get that opportunity at a local level to problem solve, they are so effective. One of the families arriving last week had 4 job opportunities lined up before they even landed at Sydney Airport. And there's another group who managed to secure housing by sending out an email to 20 churches in the local area and had the housing sorted within the day. So people are great problem solvers if you give them the opportunity to do that.
Do you think this will be bigger in regional centres or in metropolitan centres?
I think it can work really well in both. It does represent a particular opportunity, though, for regional communities that have been striving to welcome more migrants or refugees into that community, because it's not about persuading someone to uproot themselves from, one of the biggest cities into a regional area, but actually inviting them to come into that community from day one of their Australian journey and providing them with the support that they need when they get there.
And how much of all of this was inspired by the case of the Nadesalingam family and the whole Home to Billow movement Did that cement for you that this was something Australians were keen to do?
Look, there's obviously some similarities when we see how passionate that community was about supporting that family, but this particular endeavour predates that situation. We knew from the Canadian example and from other similar programs around the world that the community is passionate and wants to do its bit. And when we look at the news and we see how dire the situation is globally, we feel despair. But when we feel like there's something that we can do at a practical level, people want to engage with that. They want to do their bit to help. It's not just up to government.
Lisa Button, thank you.
Thank you.
Rohingya refugees say they have no future in Bangladesh, 5 years after fleeing horrific violence at the hands of the Myanmar military. Close to 1 million people are still stuck in overcrowded and unsanitary camps in Cox's Bazar with no solution in sight. Aid group Médecins Sans Frontières is calling on the Australian government to issue specific humanitarian visa allocations for Rohingya people. Earlier, I spoke to Arun Jagan, the outgoing Chief of Mission for MSF in Cox's Bazar.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's been 5 years since hundreds of thousands of Rohingya fled violence in Myanmar across the border to Bangladesh and the refugee camp at Cox's Bazar. Almost 1 million people are still there. How are they 5 years on, mentally and physically?
They're not doing great. What you said was correct. 1 million people who are living in refugee camps. They're a heavily traumatized population who fled violence almost 5 years ago. They're completely dependent on aid, and they have very little hope for the future. I'd also like to add that while physical health is a challenge in many refugee camps, there is a particular problem here with mental health. Now, remember, 5 years ago, this population fled one of the most devastating situations in Myanmar. I remember clearly like it was yesterday, hundreds of thousands of people streaming across the border, fleeing targeted violence. We treated thousands of people for violence wounds, including bullet wounds, knife wounds, and also physical strangulation. On top of this, we treated over 100 women and children for sexual violence. This was a heavily traumatized experience for these people. And now they're prohibited from working. They cannot access education beyond primary school. So there's no real solution put on the table for them. MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, we're the largest provider of mental health care in Cox's Bazar district. And we know and can see the impact that this is having on their mental health.
Is there any hope in sight for resettlement for these people?
Every Rohingya person that I've spoken to, they all want to return back to Myanmar. That's their home. But ever since the 1970s, there's been cyclical and targeted violence against the Rohingya. Until the situation in Rakhine State can be safely guaranteed for them, until a safe, dignified and voluntary return can be guaranteed, there is very little chance for them to return, and that's what they're asking for.
Why are you calling on the Australian government to issue humanitarian visas for Rohingya in particular? Why are their needs greater than those of other groups?
The Rohingya are the largest group of stateless people in the world. Statelessness has its own vulnerabilities. Right now, they are prohibited from working, they are unable to access education beyond primary school years, and as I've mentioned before, they're particularly vulnerable. Their health is particularly vulnerable as long as they're continuing to live in camp-like conditions. That, in addition to the cycle of violence that they've been subject to since the 1970s, I believe qualifies them for special consideration.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's not just refugees fleeing conflict and violence, there are also environmental refugees. Melting zombie ice from Greenland will mean sea levels will rise by more than 250 millimetres. It's the equivalent of 110 trillion metric tonnes of ice. And low-lying countries, especially South Pacific nations, are at real risk of being swamped. Joseph Sekulu is the Pacific Managing Director of 350.org, and he joins me now from London. Joseph, thanks for your time. Zombie ice is melting and the Pacific is already seeing internally displaced people due to climate impacts. Is it inevitable that we will soon see climate refugees in the Pacific region?
Oh, thank you for having me. Oh, I would say that it's definitely inevitable that we are going to see people displaced because of climate impacts in the Pacific. If we continue to look at things like the IPCC report and what the scientists laid out for us, and the trajectory that has been planned out shows that people may be displaced by mid-century. I think if you talk about the Pacific though, and we talk about displacement, our people will choose to not leave. And I guess that's a right we have to honor, is the right to stay. And then rather than thinking about how can we assist people in terms of their mobility, we first need to think about how we can mitigate the effects of climate so our people don't have to leave.
Do other nations outside the Pacific understand how real, how immediate a concern climate change displacement is for Pacific peoples?
I would say it's there within the conversations, especially around global negotiations when we're at the global climate conferences, the United Nations. These are things that we're already talking about already setting up the frameworks in which will help people move with dignity, but it's not done with the urgency that is needed at the moment. And sometimes when we think about migration, especially from the impacts of climate, it's easy to think about it as something that's going to happen in the future. But the reality is people are being displaced by it now. People will be displaced by it in the very near future. And so we have to already think about the frameworks that will help them move with agency and with dignity. But before we even get there, we need to mitigate what it is that's going to make them move. And so we need to really think about decarbonizing and mitigating the effects of climate change and ensuring that people have the right to stay. And if they move, have the right to move with dignity.
All of this, of course, is happening in Australia's region. How would you characterise Australia's relationship with the Pacific when it comes to migration? And what more could Australia be doing on all this?
I think the one thing we know to be true is that the next big wave of migration from our region will be because of people who are displaced because of climate impacts. At the moment, when we look to the relationship Australia has with the Pacific in terms of migration, I think the relationship we have now is around labour mobility. It's always been okay for our people to come to Australia and pick fruit, but if it comes for our people wanting to find a different way of life or applying for work visas, that process is really hard. And the way Australians treat migrants, the way we treat refugees, we don't have a really great history of that. It's always been a really toxic relationship Australia holds with migration, and especially when we're thinking about people who are displaced. And so a lot more work needs to be done to build the frameworks to ensure that people, especially our neighbours in the Pacific, can move and gain access to Australia and the way we move mobility-wise.
And movement outside those seasonal demands of fruit picking, as you say, a more permanent solution?
We do, and I think fruit picking has provided so many people on island the opportunity to be able to work and bring finances back in to support our families at home. But it needs to go beyond that, because at the moment what it looks like is that you can go and pick fruit in Australia, but once that is finished, there's no option for any people to be able to find residency or find other opportunities to be able to build a life. And it needs to go beyond that. Our people can't just be there just to pick fruit in Australia and then be sent back home. And if we're talking about climate displacement in our region, Australia is the biggest leading contributor to the climate crisis and to the impacts of climate crisis. And it's only fair that we treat our neighbours with the dignity they deserve and provide the frameworks in order for them to be able to move and find the opportunities that they're going to need.
Joseph Sikulu, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Since the start of the war in Ukraine, more than 3,200 Ukrainians have arrived in Australia. Regina Razumovskaya spent 7 days in a bomb shelter near the capital Kyiv before fleeing to the small rural town of Nanop, 3 hours south of Perth. And she joins me now. Regina, thank you. You and your family have been displaced twice by fighting, first from Donetsk in 2014 when the city was captured by Russian-backed separatists, and then from Kyiv this year when Russia invaded Ukraine. What has been the impact on you and your family of having to flee violence and start again, not once but twice?
Hi, Sarah. this is a really tough, challenging experience because you have to start your life from scratch. In 2014, we had to resettle within the country, leaving our property and business in Donetsk region, understanding that perhaps you would never come back there. And then just in 8 years, we had to resettle for the second time, leaving already unused set business there and again property and go and flee to Australia. So, and when you're not that young, so I'm 40 and my husband is 50, having 2 kids, that's really tough.
This year, after Russia invaded Ukraine, you went from living in a bomb shelter near Kyiv to living on a chestnut farm in Indepth, a small town 3 hours south of Perth. That must be quite the culture shock, I imagine.
Well, war was a shock. And after that, everything, so what you see is just another experience. And Australia is a real thrilling experience to me because it was not just so far away from where we live. It's just another country, huge landscapes, huge forests, and so small locations with quite a few people living here. But that's a thrilling experience already for us.
How are your kids coping with the transition?
Well, my kids, thanks God, my kids are too small. My 2 daughters have 4 and 7 years old, and they don't really understand what's going on. And my younger daughter, sometimes I just doubt that she even notices that other people talk another language, because she's trying to talk with everybody her own language, and that's really funny. Well, they both go to, the elder one go to a school and the younger one go to a kindy.
Now, you're actually Russian by birth and you still have family in Russia. Do you talk to them about all of this, about the conflict and everything that's followed?
That's a really hard issue to me because now I'm in total disconnect with my family because my mother, my dad, and my brother, they are supporting the Russian propaganda and all the actions done by Putin. And for me, all the feelings and the situation is so raw, I can't stand it. And I decided to step away, and I told them, please just stop any communications until everybody of us will understand where's the evil and where's the good side.
So fraught. Now, you and your family are on special 3-year visas. The community of Indepth has rallied around you. When that time is up, if the war is over and you have the opportunity to go home, would you go home?
That is a very good question because we, with my husband, sometimes question ourselves with that. If it were not for kids, my husband and me would go back once the war is over because we have our business there, our property, people, acquaintances, relatives. But you see that an after-war country is not a safe place for the kids. And you have to deal with the breakage of any system. Let's take healthcare, any educational system. So you will not guarantee a safety anymore there. And thinking about the kids, I have doubts that we are not coming in near future to Ukraine.
Regina Razumovskaya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's the program for this evening. I'm Sarah Dingle. Bye for now.